number of years ago, published a brief piece in a popular Civil War magazine discussing the origins of McClellan's image as this feckless commander and suggested some mild revisions. The response was immediate and predictable. In the next issue, the letters poured in, utterly dismissive of Grimsley's effort, unwilling to consider any other interpretation than the by now standard one, which reminds me of the comment once made by the late great historian Reed Mitchell. Civil War people like to hear the same stories told in the same way. And I think too many of us may fall into that category. And I think opinions about McClellan, in many respects, are almost set in stone. And they're not likely to change. They're not likely to change. But in his own day, McClellan had many warm friends and political supporters. And of course, no shortage of critics and enemies. He had the misfortune to clash with Lincoln, another controversial figure of the time, who became the savior of the Union, the great emancipator, and the martyred president in the aftermath of his assassination. The deification of Lincoln hardly helped George B. McClellan. As Lincoln's private secretary, John Hay, noted in a letter to his fellow secretary, John Nicolay, as they were preparing their 10-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln, this is what Hay says: "I think I have left the impression of McClellan's mutinous infidelity, and I have done it in a perfectly courteous manner. It is of the utmost moment that we should seem fair to him while we are destroying him." And of course, Hay and Nicolay have a great deal to do with what we think about George B. McClellan. McClellan himself sought vindication in an autobiography, but did not live to finish it. His literary executor, W.C. Prime, hardly helped matters by bringing McClellan's partially completed manuscript into print and adding excerpts from the letters between the general and his wife. It does. There's George B. and his wife, Mary Ellen Marcy McClellan. And Prime puts in the back of McClellan's memoirs excerpts from the letters that McClellan sent to his wife, very revealing letters. In fact, the originals of these letters have not survived. These are only partial transcriptions. And what Prime stuck into McClellan's autobiography, he took all the personal stuff out and just had things related to the war and politics and that sort of thing. And this has served as fodder for McClellan's critics ever since. You read McClellan's letters, there's a lot of basis for criticism. By 1881, McClellan had completed his memoirs, but he and his wife did some traveling. The memoirs were stored in a warehouse in New Jersey, and they were destroyed in a fire. McClellan began anew in a somewhat desultory, one might say McClellan-like fashion. Didn't get very far. And so when he died in 1885, this new manuscript had only reached May 1862 in the war. And so W.C. Prime took over the project, and Prime did more to shape the final product than McClellan did. And we might add, do damage to McClellan's historical reputation. Now, as for the historians, they have not exactly set out to destroy McClellan, but the weight of their work has been largely negative. Consider this lineup. In the anti-McClellan camp, we have giants of the Civil War field: Bruce Catton, T. Harry Williams, my LSU mentor, Stephen Sears, James McPherson. For the defense, we have a very good unpublished dissertation by Joseph Harsh, Ethan Rafus's fine study of McClellan as strategist and commander, and a few recent works that will defend McClellan's campaign operations. And then there's a documentary by Ken Burns. I assume virtually everybody in this room has seen Ken Burns' film. Ken Burns is not kind to George B. McClellan. He simply follows in the footsteps of Bruce Catton and the other critics. So the question arises, why is McClellan so often reviled by almost all who hold an opinion of the man? Is it strictly a matter of his military shortcomings, or is there something more to the story than that? At a conference several years ago, Ethan Rayfus, who's somewhat of a defender of McClellan, remarked, I think only partly in jest, that McClellan reminded him of the guy in high school who was captain of the football team, dated the head cheerleader, was effortlessly successful, and you absolutely hated it. And young George McClellan was like this guy. He led a charmed life, grew up quite comfortable middle-class circumstances. His father was a physician. His mother was a sort of genteel model of respectability and success. And at the age of 13, McClellan entered the University of Pennsylvania. He did not graduate, however, because his father persuaded a friendly congressman to get him a West Point nomination. By the end of his first year, McClellan stood very high in his plebe class. He impressed some West Point classmates as a near genius who excelled in any number of subjects and displayed a really easy confidence in his own ability. And of course, it's very easy to draw a sharp contrast in terms of background, education, achievement between the young McClellan and the young Abraham Lincoln. But there was one quality, I think, that the two men shared, and that quality was ambition. So in many ways, I would frame the story of McClellan and Lincoln as one of clashing ambitions and clashing views on strategy and other things, of course, as well. In their younger days, both these men strove to make their mark in the world, and each held forth early on the promise and perils of this kind of striving. As the outgoing president of the Dialectic Society at West Point, 19-year-old George McClellan viewed his classmates, the famous West Point class of 1846, as the key to national success. Not only success in war, but success more broadly. In addressing his fellow cadets, McClellan declared the great difference between the officer and the private is that one is supposed to be an educated and informed man, whilst the other is a passive instrument in the hands of his superior. McClellan's faith in an elite class, indeed in a natural hierarchy, would hardly sit well in democratic America. But his confidence in the power of superior minds, I think in many ways was striking and unequivocal. And he maintained this throughout his life. In his view, without educated officers, armies would become little more than mobs of the most depraved and wicked men who would spread mindless pillage and devastation. Power based on the virtue of intellectual superiority is infinitely greater and more lasting than that which is the result of mere physical qualities, McClellan tells his fellow cadets. Now, he could not ignore, even in 1846, the nation's mounting sectional tensions, and even alluded to the horrors of civil war. But he believed that in such a crisis, trained officers would hold the balance in our hands, and therefore the Army should ever incline to the conservative party, whose highest goals must be to preserve the Union. At the same time, well, not at the same time chronologically, but it's in making our comparison here, on a wintry day in January 1838, Abraham Lincoln, then a young member of the Illinois legislature, spoke on the perpetuation of our political institutions, one of Lincoln's most famous speeches. This aspiring politician and lawyer deplored what he called the increasing disregard for the law. Like young McClellan, he worried about the prevalence of wild and furious passions in America. In his view, the only real danger to the American government would come from within. He pointedly said, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Lincoln dreaded a lawless spirit spreading through society like some great contagion. And in such an atmosphere, he warned, there might arise a man of boundless ambition, eager to claim the mantle of savior. As Lincoln put it, towering genius disdains the beaten path. It thirsts and burns for distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving freemen. And when such a one does arise, it will require the people to be united with each other, attached to the government and laws, and generally intelligent to successfully frustrate his designs. So the often striking contrast in their background and experience should not obscure this strong thread of ambition running through both Lincoln and McClellan. For McClellan, service in the Mexican-American War or his later work as a railroad executive had not been all that satisfying or fulfilling, at least in terms of obtaining his ambitions. But the coming of war in 1861 means that George McClellan's long frustrated drive for martial distinction, if not greatness, might soon be gratified. Politically, McClellan, I think, had absorbed a goodly amount of his father's Whiggish conservatism, including a sometimes haughty disdain for the mass of humanity. Exposure to politicians in Washington had given him an equally jaundiced view of that breed. Of all the Civil War generals, I think George McClellan and William T. Sherman could compete for the greatest disdain for politicians. McClellan later described himself as a strong Democrat of the Stephen A. Douglas School. He recalled the mounting sectional tensions as perhaps rendered inevitable by the violent course of a comparatively small number of men on both sides of the line during the 30 years preceding the war. Like a large swath of the northern population, I believe, McClellan blamed the Civil War on extremists in both the North and the South. He remained wary of Republican politicians in Washington who failed to represent what he considered to be the true sentiments of most Northerners. And his own ambitions obviously shape how he views the war, his role, and his relations with the president, which is our topic for this evening. McClellan comes to see himself as indispensable. And this is only going to lead McClellan to work far too long and hard, but also prevent him from sharing his plans and problems with subordinates, the War Department, and tragically enough, with President Lincoln. Early in the war, McClellan displayed a penchant for careful planning, an obsession with detail, hesitation at the moment of crisis. But these qualities were not what contemporaries, including many Republicans, at first noticed. Not long after McClellan's promotion to Major General, the strongly Republican Chicago Tribune declared that no fitter appointment could be made. Contrast that to what the Tribune is going to say later on. The New York Herald, much more conservative publication, said there's a charm in this name, McClellan, which will yet work as a talisman upon the American heart. Two of Lincoln's secretaries, including the critical John Hay and William Stoddard, filed anonymous newspaper dispatches praising McClellan to the skies. For his part, McClellan basked in the attention as well he might. He comes to Washington. He says, I receive letter after letter, have conversation after conversation, calling on me to save the nation, he tells his wife. He says, I find myself in a new and strange position here, he writes to Nellie. President, Cabinet, General Scott, the General-in-Chief of the Army, are all deferring to me. By some strange magic, I seem to have become the power of the land. Even some small success might now lead for calls for him to become a dictator, a possibility he tried to treat with a light touch. There was now ominously talk of the presidency, and McClellan believed that God has placed a great work in my hands. On being appointed General-in-Chief, once he'd gotten rid of his sort of shoved Winfield Scott out the door, McClellan told Lincoln, I can do it all. I can do it all. Now, such ambition, overweening ambition, might well have resonated or alarmed President Lincoln. But William Herndon knew one thing for sure about his old law partner, Abraham Lincoln. And that is that Lincoln was very ambitious. This is what McClellan had to say about that. That man who thinks Lincoln calmly sat down and gathered his robes about him, waiting for the people to call him, has a very erroneous knowledge of Lincoln. And in a much quoted passage, Herndon added, Lincoln's ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. In a less quoted letter, Herndon was even more pointed, saying Lincoln's ambition was never satisfied. To him, it was a consuming fire which smothered his finer feelings. Lincoln set his sights not only on political success, but on lasting influence, and at times appeared to see himself as destined for some great work. But in their respective roles as general and president, McClellan and Lincoln are going to have to work together. And here is where the problem arises. Now, both men were remarkably visible to the soldiers, especially during McClellan's frequently held troop reviews. Junior officers and enlisted men echoed press reports in praising McClellan for instilling a greater ardor and determination in the recently demoralized regiments that had been they'd been demoralized by the Battle of Bull Run. To the troops, McClellan was not only a highly visible commander, but a very humane one, an approachable figure, despite his dignified bearing and impressive appearance on horseback. Now, McClellan was not a great orator or anything like that, but McClellan had the ability to draw others, especially officers, into his orbit. We forget at our peril how many people of the time greatly admired George B. McClellan. And even the historians most critical of McClellan have praised his organizational abilities, and some have acknowledged his strategic sense. In 1882, Francis Winthrop Palfrey, who had served in the 20th Massachusetts Infantry, the famed Harvard Regiment, praised McClellan as both organizer and strategist. He noted the general's failure to deploy his forces with enough speed and vigor to obtain decisive results, though Palfrey might have added that decisive results eluded virtually all Civil War generals. For Palfrey, the question of timing was especially important in shaping McClellan's historical image, because McClellan had faced the Confederates early in the war at the height of their strength. At the war's outset, none of the generals had commanded large armies in combat. And given the eventual size of Civil War armies, the limits of staff, communication, and transportation, that task of commanding these large armies often seemed beyond the capabilities of even the better generals. Ulysses S. Grant, in an often quoted passage, would later describe McClellan as one of the great mysteries of the war. And what you have on the screen here is a statement that's hardly ever cited, but this is what Grant went on to say about McClellan. It has always seemed to me that the critics of McClellan do not consider this vast and cruel responsibility. The war, a new thing to all of us. The Army knew everything to do from the outset with a restless people in Congress. McClellan was a young man when this devolved upon him. And if he did not succeed, it was because the conditions of success were so trying. If McClellan had gone into the war as Sherman, Thomas, or Meade had fought his way up, I have no reason to suppose that he would not have won as high a distinction as any of us. It's pretty high praise coming from U.S. Grant. William T. Sherman was also an admirer of McClellan. Now, however that might be, Civil War campaigns, and if you read campaign studies, I think this becomes apparent very quickly. Civil War campaigns often seem like a series of blunders and missed opportunities. And the inability of generals to follow up, even after victories, was striking. McClellan's supporters in the Army and out complained of political interference by the Lincoln administration, even as the president and cabinet grew frustrated with McClellan's secrecy, slowness, and complaints. Yet a more nuanced evaluation of McClellan's military record, or a more critical assessment of Lincoln's leadership, should hardly mean ignoring the general's shortcomings or failing to see how the president grew in his role as commander-in-chief. In what might be termed the standard narrative, the standard anti-McClellan narrative, contains a great deal of truth. So if you are very critical of McClellan, you strongly dislike McClellan, you've got a good deal of evidence in your favor. The evidence is abundant. You can't take an uncritical view of George McClellan at all. That's not the point. But I think we need to go beyond this standard narrative a bit to see what went wrong. Certainly, historians have noted McClellan's slowness and timidity, his repeated overestimation of enemy numbers. He employed the famous detective Allan Pinkerton to try to estimate the size of the opposing forces. This did not work out very well. Pinkerton was ill-equipped to deal with military intelligence, plus McClellan tended to add a few more numbers to Pinkerton's estimates. And so, the one thing even McClellan defenders can't get around is the fact that he consistently overestimates by a substantial margin the forces arrayed against him. McClellan also seemed oblivious to public impatience. He appeared unsure of himself when the moment for decisive action arrived, as students of the Civil War have long recognized. Now, both Lincoln and McClellan considered the Union to be a sacred trust, but they could not agree on military strategy. McClellan, the West Point engineer, favored meticulous preparation. He believed the war might be won by crushing the Confederates in a single campaign. In his view, defeating the Southern Rebellion demanded overwhelming military strength. He once proposed raising a force of 273,000 men for a series of coastal operations. He wanted to carefully prepare such a large force and not risk defeat that might encourage the rebels. Given his political philosophy and West Point training, McClellan favored maneuvering over fighting. He preferred moving along rivers and railroad lines, Peninsula Campaign being an example of moving along rivers, rather than advancing overland. That McClellan would not throw his troops headlong into battle or assault heavily fortified positions partly explains his popularity in the ranks. However, such a strategy risked something that Lincoln believed the country could not afford, and that risk was delay. And Lincoln had to respond to political pressures that McClellan often cavalierly dismissed. Now, more broadly speaking, Lincoln and McClellan come to see the nature of this war in quite different ways. Lincoln's views, however, evolved, albeit haltingly. McClellan's views did not. McClellan failed to recognize how changing attitudes about the role of slavery in the conflict meant that more conciliatory and conservative policies were simply losing public favor. McClellan deplored slavery, but shared the racial views of his time, sometimes expressed in strong language. And McClellan, I think, like a large swath of the American population, actually, when it comes down to it, was rather indifferent to the whole slavery question. He opposed both confiscation and emancipation, even as Lincoln was coming to favor both as necessary means to overcome Confederate resistance. McClellan identified with his soldiers, and many of them identified with him. Again, he was quite visible in camp, and he was known for looking after the welfare of his troops. Perhaps he looked after them too well. After the Confederate attack at Seven Pines at the end of May 1862, McClellan wrote to his wife, "I feel sure of success. So good is the spirit of my men, and so great their ardor. But I am tired of the sickening sight of the battlefield, with its mangled corpses and poor suffering wounded. Victory has no charms for me when purchased at such cost." That, of course, begged the question of what victory would cost and what strategy might best achieve that end. McClellan clearly had powerful support in the Army of the Potomac. Though given his obsession with professionalism, his attitude toward the volunteers was at times condescending, though the enlisted men never seemed to quite pick up on that. McClellan may have been a capital D Democrat, but he was no small D Democrat. And throughout his career, McClellan not only had this firm belief in professional military leadership, McClellan had trouble dealing with superiors, whether military or civilian. His frustration and anger would absolutely boil over if a proposed strategy or request for more men were not approved. For his part, Lincoln showed great patience with McClellan, at least until the early months of 1862, where, despite strong reservations, he reluctantly goes along with McClellan's Peninsula campaign, but removes McClellan as general-in-chief. He will command the Army of the Potomac, but he'll no longer be general-in-chief. Lincoln's appointment of corps commanders in the Army of the Potomac created additional friction. And then there's the question of why did Lincoln agree to the Peninsula campaign plan when he doubted it would succeed? In any event, there follows a series of controversies familiar to this group, I'm sure. Had McClellan left Washington adequately defended when he went to the Peninsula? What about the withholding of troops from McClellan's army? What about McClellan's frequent calls for reinforcements? He never seemed to have enough. What about the question of whether the Army of the Potomac should have been withdrawn from the Virginia Peninsula after the 7 days? And of course, then there's the general's conduct of the Maryland campaign as well. And here, of course, we have Lincoln and McClellan meeting at Antietam after the battle. I sure wish we knew what the two men said to each other. We have nothing from Lincoln's side, and the only thing we have from McClellan's side is what he wrote after the war. So we know relatively little, except obviously Lincoln wants McClellan to get moving. McClellan hardly helps matters in dealing with Lincoln with his complaining and at times self-pitying dispatches. Lincoln himself had much to learn. Lincoln could be oblivious to logistical constraints. He had unrealistic expectations for military success based on the Union's superior resources. Lincoln, for example, thought it would be easy to conduct a military campaign in East Tennessee. If you know anything about East Tennessee geography, you know that presents some obstacles. Now, of course, Lincoln eventually develops a steely resolve in working with generals. But Lincoln himself pays a price for his own indecisiveness early in the war and allowing generals, including McClellan, to bypass the chain of command. As for McClellan, his opinions of Lincoln run hot and cold. He often saw the president as an uncultivated teller of droll stories who failed to grasp important elements of military strategy. Stephen Sears once counted the number of meetings between Lincoln and McClellan. I think it's 147. It was in excess of 100. The exact number doesn't matter. The interesting thing is we know nothing about the vast majority of these meetings between Lincoln and McClellan. You think we know a great deal about the Lincoln-McClellan relationship, and we do, but there's a whole lot we don't know as well. McClellan often fails to explain his thinking and plans to the president. His secrecy with the commander-in-chief is just a major blunder, it seems to me. And Lincoln and McClellan come to regard each other pretty warily. Lincoln would even occasionally show flashes of temper, but McClellan could easily grow out of sorts and bristle with self-righteousness. The letters to his wife often bristle with self-righteousness. And the conflict between Lincoln and McClellan often spills over into the political arena and even divides the president's advisors. Some members of the cabinet are very strong critics of McClellan. Others are somewhat more favorably disposed. The politicians and journalists of various stripes had a great deal to do and a great deal to say about the relationship between Lincoln and McClellan. Then, too, the men in uniform, enlisted men as well as officers. These guys read newspapers. They follow politics. They develop their own ideas on strategy. They've sometimes been called thinking bayonets. And if you read their letters and diaries, they are. McClellan absolutely deplored the influence of politics on the conduct of the war. But however much he might want to insulate himself from those horrible Washington politicians, that was simply not possible. Politics became inextricably entangled in the war's conduct, something that McClellan never could quite realize. Though it's certainly ironic, given McClellan's jaundiced view of politicians, if not of democracy itself, that he's nominated for president in 1864. What an unlikely presidential candidate. McClellan had not sought political glory, he had sought martial glory. He claimed to disdain political ambition, even as Democratic politicians and newspaper editors raised the possibility of a presidential nomination very early on. McClellan himself drew a Whiggish distinction between politicians and statesmen. Of course, you know what a statesman is. It's a dead politician. He viewed himself as principled and his opponents as conniving. He met with radical Republican senators early on and then tactlessly told them he was fighting to preserve the Union, not for the Republican Party or for emancipation. The always suspicious members of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War worked tirelessly to prove that McClellan was an incompetent, if not a disloyal, commander. So too, McClellan's erstwhile friend, Edwin Stanton, after he becomes Secretary of War, becomes an implacable critic. And of course, Stanton has his own issues that we won't get into this evening. It seems to me that when Democratic leaders tout McClellan as a presidential candidate as early as the fall of 1861, This is going to hurt the general's standing, both with the Lincoln administration and to some degree in the Army itself. And of course, the conflict between Lincoln and McClellan reach a culmination when the Democrats choose the general as their presidential nominee in 1864. Now, historians can argue about the critical presidential elections in American history, but I would submit 1864 is the most remarkable election in American history. It's probably the most remarkable election in world history. I can't think of another example of a country engaged in a civil war conducting a presidential election in the midst of the conflict. The fact that it was held at all is absolutely remarkable. Lincoln himself said, "We cannot have free government without elections. If the rebellion could force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us." And so, despite repeated calls after November 1862, when McClellan's removed from command, to give McClellan another command, Lincoln's own ambition for a second term dictated keeping McClellan at arm's length. Because every time the Army of the Potomac folded, especially at Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, there were cries, "Bring back McClellan." Troops in the Army of the Potomac cheered wildly right before the Battle of Gettysburg because of rumors that McClellan was back with them. Obviously, false rumors. And then, ironically, in disputes over Reconstruction policy, two of the president's radical Republican critics accused Lincoln of unbridled political ambition. During the summer of 1864, the war had reached something of a low point for the Union. The uncertain military situation, along with lukewarm support, if not outright opposition from some Republicans, made Lincoln's prospects for re-election seem doubtful. We forget how uncertain the political situation was at that point. The influential editor Horace Greeley wrote to Lincoln early in the summer, "Our bleeding, bankrupt, almost dying country longs for peace. It shudders at the prospect of fresh conscriptions, of further wholesale devastations, of new rivers of human blood." Greeley warned if the administration did not do something, the Republicans would badly lose in November. This is the summer of 64. More conservative Republicans worried about the impression that Lincoln was more interested in emancipation than in union. And throw in the unpopular draft and taxes, they warned that emancipation mania might ruin the party. On the other end, the radical Republicans, too, were skeptical about Lincoln, and some longed for an alternative nominee. Lincoln's own campaign manager, Henry J. Raymond, on August 12, 1864, said, "If the election were held today, Lincoln is going to lose." He blamed the military stalemate and the slavery question, and then suggested that Lincoln send peace commissioners to Jefferson Davis and drop his insistence on the acceptance of emancipation as a precondition for negotiations. Lincoln refused. By the fall of 1864, however, much had changed. Union military victories, especially by Sherman and Sheridan, also the success at Mobile, and opposition missteps rescued the president. The so-called Copperhead influence of the Democratic Convention, along with the peace plank and the platform that declared the war a failure, killed McClellan's prospects of winning the soldier vote. I'm convinced that the Democrats had not put that peace plank war failure thing into the platform, McClellan would have gotten a lot more soldier votes. The soldiers tell you this. I voted for McClellan had it not been for that unpatriotic platform. McClellan himself agonized. I mean, here he's asked to accept a platform that calls the war a failure. He can't do it. He agonizes. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? He delays. Lincoln wryly remarked that perhaps McClellan was entrenching. In the end, McClellan said, no peace can be permanent without union. So here you have the nominee of the Democratic Party repudiating the major plank of the Democratic platform. And there are a number of cartoons that deal with this. I like this one in particular that shows McClellan caught between war and peace. And he's having trouble deciding. Great two-horse act. And he delays and delays and finally repudiates the plan. Of course, as we know, Lincoln handily wins re-election, and many soldiers not only voted for Lincoln, but thought this sealed the Confederacy's fate. The New York diarist, George Templeton Strong, detected an even more universal significance. The crisis has been passed. The most momentous popular election ever held since votes were invented has decided against treason and disunion. The American people can be trusted to take care of the national honor. Both candidates in 1864 were willing to accept the popular verdict, whatever that might be. Both, I think, Lincoln and McClellan ultimately were patriots. And shortly after the election, McClellan finally resigns from the army and leaves for Europe to travel with his family. Yet I think it's important to remember as we conclude how many people at the time lacked confidence in Lincoln's decision as commander-in-chief. And by the same token, there's a need to acknowledge how high McClellan stood in the estimation of many contemporaries. As I said at the outset, both men had many warm supporters, and both men had many staunch critics. In the aftermath of Union victory, of course, and Lincoln's assassination, much of that was forgotten. Now, historical reputations are constantly being revised, but McClellan's reputation appears fixed, even as each generation favors a slightly different, albeit mostly positive, version of the Lincoln saga. This might all have struck both men as ironic, though McClellan lacked any appreciation of irony whatsoever, whereas Lincoln sometimes reveled in it. Yet on hearing news of Lincoln's assassination, remember McClellan's still in Europe, he's in Rome at the time when the assassination takes place, meeting with the Pope, interestingly enough. McClellan did note one irony that hit home with so many other Americans. He wrote, "How strange it is that the military death of the rebellion should have been followed with such tragic quickness by the atrocious murder of Mr. Lincoln." Thinking back on their relationship, McClellan remarked, "Now I cannot forget all that has been unpleasant between us and remember only the brighter parts of our intercourse." Unfortunately for McClellan, history would later focus on the unpleasant aspects of the relationship. In a sermon preached a little over a week after Lincoln's death, a leading Presbyterian minister observed that the nation had attempted to make McClellan an idol after the Union disaster at Bull Run, but God had refused to allow it. Instead, Lincoln became the martyr president and McClellan his foil, a simple story later baked into the standard Civil War narrative, and one that to this day often resists even the mildest revisions. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate your attention.
Don't leave yet. We're going to do questions. All right. Do we have any questions from the audience for Professor Rable? Have one back there.
George, please. Don't be so formal.
Hang on 1 second.
A couple of very quick questions. I was wondering why we don't split McClellan's career into two pieces. The building of the army, which no other general had did after he did it, versus the using of the army. exactly when you were mentioning, can we split those two things apart so we can have, would it be different if we were able to look at them that way? And secondly, in Grant's comments, could you see Sherman, Meade, or Thomas, looking at a bloody battlefield and saying this victory was too expensive?
An answer to the second question, probably no. Okay. I think your first point is very well taken. I think historians have often done this. Even McClellan's staunchest critics praises organizational ability in molding the Army of the Potomac and that sort of thing, and then his inability to use that army effectively. And I do think you have to separate those two. And what I tried to do at much greater length in my book is look at the details of how this relationship falls apart based on the formation of the army, based on differences in strategy, and based on how McClellan uses or fails to use the army. And I think as long as people study the American Civil War, we have to talk about Lincoln and McClellan.
Do we have other questions from the audience? We have one over here.
So I actually have two questions. One is, what did Winfield Scott, the Mexican War leader, think of McClellan? Was he, still alive enough to have an opinion? I think he was displaced at the start of the Civil War, so he should have had some opinion of McClellan. Do we know?
Yes, there's a long history between Scott and McClellan. In fact, McClellan has some difficulties with Scott even in the Mexican War. The general Scott really kind of cultivates McClellan, and McClellan doesn't like all the attention he's getting from Scott, doesn't like to dine with him and things like that. And when McClellan gets to Washington, he thinks that, well, Scott's old, he's well beyond his prime, he needs to retire. And the two men have a terrible time dealing with each other. Both are very prickly characters. And McClellan really maneuvers Scott out of his position as general-in-chief. And then, he goes to the train station and when Scott's leaving and praises the general and all that. Now, as far as what Scott thinks after that, we don't know a whole lot. Lincoln at one point visits Scott. And I think Lincoln wanted Scott to tell him to get rid of McClellan, and Scott didn't tell him to get rid of McClellan. We don't really have Scott turning on McClellan, but Scott was very frustrated with McClellan at the time when he was serving as general-in-chief, and McClellan was then simply commander of the Army of the Potomac. They have a very testy relationship. Your second question.
I was wondering, my understanding was that McClellan went to Europe in the late 1850s to observe the Risorgimento, the Italian War of Liberation between the French liberated Italy from the Austrians. I was just wondering if you have any insight into what did he learn, or did it, change him in any way or anything like
Well,
that?
he observes the Crimean War too. And yes, he wrote a long treatise on cavalry, on the use of cavalry as a result of that assignment. And of course, the fact he's sent to Europe in the first place shows how high McClellan stood in the antebellum army at the time, to be sent to Europe on this observation mission. What he writes on cavalry is not all that insightful in some ways, so you can certainly criticize McClellan's use and misuse of cavalry when he commands the Army of the Potomac. But I think it probably reinforces McClellan's belief in military professionalism. I think one of the most important words, for understanding McClellan is professionalism. And this is a time in America when the idea of professional expertise is gaining ground. In some ways, McClellan represents a kind of wave of the future here. And so I think that trip to Europe was important. And his report is published by a commercial publisher on the eve of the Civil War and reviewed. So people knew about McClellan before he arrives in Washington to get command of the army.
George, just to clarify on that, when McClellan was in the Crimea observing the Crimean War, that would have been about 1855 timeframe.
Right.
Did he also then travel to Italy and observe the conflict in Italy as well?
I think he did, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
Now, you know, when he and his family go to Europe after the war, he keeps this travel diary, which the McClellan papers, by the way, are fully available online from the Library of Congress. You can read his travel diary. They go all over the place. It's incredible. When he's in Rome, he decides he's glad he lives in a Protestant country. His wife had turned him into a Presbyterian, and he always referred to as my little Presbyterian. And I think religion was important to McClellan, something that some previous McClellan biographers have not recognized. But there's a fair amount of religious references in his correspondence.
All right. We got a few more questions. See, they're gaining confidence in asking questions.
I think I could ask mine. Did McClellan ever meet Lincoln before he became president?
Yes, in Illinois. And there are some people think there was some hostility there. The evidence is, to me, it's pretty sketchy. McClellan, as a railroad executive, helps Stephen A. Douglas with transportation during the period of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And, you know, some people think they were, you know, maybe there was some early tension there as well. And of course, Lincoln's a big railroad attorney. So they had some contact there as well.
So you're telling me an executive of a railroad didn't like his attorney? I find this hard to believe. Don has a question.
How active did McClellan actually pursue the nomination in 1864? You mentioned earlier, as early as 1861, some people were already talking about him becoming presidential nominee. So did he actually pursue this himself as well?
I wish there was a simple answer to that question. So I'll play the professor here and do on the one hand and on the other hand routine, which professors are great at doing. Sometimes we run out of hands, but McClellan is a pretty diffident presidential candidate. In fact, at one point he tells his mother, I'm absolutely not interested in this. I don't want to do this. But his friends in New York keep pushing this. Now, in those days, if you're a presidential candidate, you're not supposed to be seen seeking the nomination. So you don't attend the convention. A committee is sent to inform you that you have received a nomination, and then you humbly accept it. You try to pretend like you're surprised. And during the campaign, McClellan will not take advice from his political advisors. You know, we worry today about the influence of campaign consultants. McClellan didn't take any advice. His Democratic advisors wanted him to round up support in the Army based on his relationship with general officers. McClellan didn't want to do this. He didn't want to meet with other politicians. He told one of his advisors at one point, do whatever you can so I can avoid meeting with these people. I don't want to have anything to do with it. I mean, he is a very ineffective candidate. Plus, he has the problem of running with a deeply divided Democratic Party.
We had a few more questions in the center over here.
I had a comment I'd like to reply to you. I think the real difference between Lincoln and McClellan was not starting with strategy, it started with what their vision and mission was. McClellan put the Army together so he could complete his mission, that's hold South at bay and not destroy them, and not really win the war, but have them come back to where they were. And Lincoln wanted to win the war. And two people can't work together if they don't have the same mission, whether it's in business or whether it's in war.
And I think the question of mission, that's part of the strategy. You know, McClellan will not embrace emancipation as a necessary means to winning the war, which Lincoln comes to embrace. Absolutely.
That's part of their vision
Yeah.
and mission. It
Yeah.
ultimately goes
Yeah.
back to that. If you aren't following your mission, you're not going to be successful. But if you have two people that are trying to work together and have the same mission, somebody needs to pick the resume up and leave.
And McClellan wants to win the war, but he wants to win the war in a different way than Lincoln wants to win the war.
So from what I read on McClellan, he was a well-trained soldier, but he was using his training to support his mission, build the army, but then to hold them at bay and not win. Whereas Lincoln, I think, was anti-slavery to begin with, and if you look at his first inaugural address, basically stating that, but he did not do anything because the U.S. Constitution at that time did not allow him to do it, but made the statement if they ever gave him the right to do that, he would, and that's what ultimately happened when they got the amendment.
Well, the literature on Lincoln and slavery is vast, and historians are in great disagreement about how fast Lincoln really wanted to move on emancipation. Some insist, as you said from the outset, he wants to do it, realizes the constitutional limitations.
But he was a pragmatist in taking it step by step, walking this tightrope between 150 different individual missions of abolition versus let's just go back to where we were, and he had all of these factions to work with, and walking that tightrope to get where he wanted to.
And he also embraces colonization at points, which has also caused no end of controversy.
But Frederick Douglass at one time did too.
Not very much with Douglass. And Douglass was we forget how critical Douglass was of Lincoln throughout much of the war.
Yeah.
But Douglass came to realize Lincoln's virtues.
But if you look at his three autobiographies, he started off, Douglass did that the only way that they could get rid of slavery was to destroy the government. And as he progressed along and his autobiographies came out, Lincoln showed them the only way you could be successful was to have political power to be able to do it with, and how he was moving to do that. And they ultimately came together on a lot of the issues towards the end of their relationship.
Yeah, he starts off as a Garrisonian abolitionist, but changes.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. We're peppering you, George.
That's good.
Keep you on your toes.
I like questions.
All right.
Why do you think McClellan had a proclivity to overestimate the strength of the Army of Northern Virginia? I know he's getting bad information from Pinkerton, but as you said, he added numbers on top of that. And as a great planner, putting together an army, you would think that he would want some idea, especially after he fought them. They didn't have 200,000 men available in the field. They kept going back to the ridiculous numbers that never existed.
That's a difficult question. You almost need to psychoanalyze the man to come up with an answer to that. And some historians have tried to do that. It's been funny, as I worked on this project, people would come up to me and say, "You're not going to defend McClellan, are you?" Surely not. The other thing is there anything new to say on the subject? And that was the question I wondered most about. But I think if you look in detail at the evolution of the relationship, including the use of numbers at various points, and how McClellan would add to those numbers. Of course, the other dispute on numbers is how many people were needed to defend Washington. And there, I think McClellan may have had a point that the Lincoln administration was not taking into account all the troops in the vicinity. But again, that's a subject of great controversy. One thing that's greatly amused me a couple people have come up to me recently and said, you know, I enjoyed your book, but I still hate McClellan. And you know, my purpose was not to make a case for either man. Actually, my purpose was to examine the relationship, and that's what I tried to do tonight. And I tried to be what I thought was sort of fair-minded to both, and that probably doesn't satisfy people, but you know, that's sort of, I'm kind of a moderate guy, so that's probably why I did it.
Okay, well, the questions keep coming. Here's another one.
Yeah, since McClellan was kind of a general that wanted to put Humpty Dumpty back together again rather than create a whole new thing, did they ever establish that he had some kind of relationship with Landingham and the Copperheads?
They didn't, the Landingham and the Copperheads did not trust McClellan, even after they got the platform. They were not happy, especially when McClellan repudiated the platform. Now, it is interesting, throughout the war, McClellan is accused of disloyalty. And McClellan was friendly with Southern cadets at West Point, there's no doubt about that. But there are radical Republicans in Congress who are absolutely convinced that McClellan is not only an effectless commander, he's a traitor. And, you know, this word comes to Lincoln, and Lincoln at one point, you know, says to McClellan, you know, people are claiming you're disloyal, and McClellan just explodes at that point. Because I don't think there's a bit of evidence of McClellan being disloyal. There's plenty of evidence of him exaggerating enemy numbers, being ineffective. He wants a conservative war policy that protects property. He doesn't want a destructive war. But you know, these charges of treason are pretty ridiculous. And if you'd asked Landingham, he would not have seen McClellan as an ally. They accepted McClellan as kind of a necessary evil. And if you look at the correspondence of the Copperheads, they're happy with the platform, not very happy with their candidate.
Was there anybody else in consideration?
We got a question back here. Hold on.
Just a tiny question. How tall was McClellan?
Little Mac was 5'4", I believe. I'm terrible at remembering numbers.
5'4" is what I heard this morning, prepping for your speech. So
Okay.
that
Okay. It's probably in my book somewhere, but hey, it's several years ago since I was doing that. And I'm terrible on numbers, so don't quote me on McClellan's height.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that could have been a factor in his relationships with Lincoln and Scott.
Oh, little man syndrome, maybe? The thing that's interesting is when people describe McClellan on a horse and Lincoln on a horse during these troop reviews, the soldiers have a lot of fun in those descriptions, and usually not in Lincoln's favor. Apparently Lincoln, I think, was a decent enough horseman, but his appearance was strange. Okay, he's got the stovepipe hat. His long johns would hang out beneath his cuffs on his trousers, and that sort of made a comical appearance. But there's a lot of soldier descriptions of both men at these troop reviews that I found very interesting. You could write an interesting little article on soldiers describing Lincoln and soldiers describing McClellan.
All right, we've got one more, and then we got to cut it. We got one last question from Mark.
Oh, the president.
Just to go back to an earlier question, what the distinction between McClellan as an organizer versus as an actual, operating general in the field, what do you think McClellan's strongest points were in the field in terms of his actual operations?
He had a very good staff. I think people agree on that. He had an effective staff. He worked very hard in the field. He worked very hard in Washington. It's very interesting when he's still in Washington. He doesn't like to he doesn't delegate very effectively, and so he's riding around all the time. Sometimes he's on horseback nearly 12 hours during a day. He gets back utterly exhausted. In Washington, he was very much a workaholic, and I think he was kind of a workaholic in the field. If you look at the times of day that he's writing to Nellie, it's often late at night. So I think his hard work is a virtue. I think his ability to command the respect and affection of his subordinates in the field was effective. Meade thought a good deal about McClellan. Meade was also a pretty conservative sort of general. His relation with Burnside gets a little rocky at times, but Burnside was basically his friend. The controversial Fitzjohn Porter. If you've not read Bill Marvel's wonderful new biography of Fitzjohn Porter, get it and read it. First of all, Bill is one of the best historians going, and he's a wonderful writer. And this is a great defense of Fitzjohn Porter. Bill's our greatest contrarian Civil War historian, so check that out. But I think there's some strength with McClellan in the field, but not in battle itself. In fact, even Ethan Rafus accuses McClellan of dereliction of duty during the 7 days for getting on the gunboat rather than being at Malvern Hill.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Geroge Rable.
Thank you very much. A lot of questions. You broke the record for question out of record.
Yeah, really it is. McClellan brings out the joy.
They weren't even hostile questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good topic. Yeah. You'll be joining us for, great.
How we never got over to see you. Very informative.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Of all the projects I've ever undertaken, this is the one I get the least confidence. Maybe that helped.
Well, you pointed
And one of the things I didn't get into is what Klein basically did for the period after May 1862, he just threw in McClellan's 1864 report. And apparently some documents were left out, some controversy about that. Generals writing memoirs. There are issues, including with Grant's famous.
Sure, yeah. What's he leaving out
The rest of
and
us.
what's puffing about?
George, I've got a few comments from around the globe. San Francisco says McClellan and Johnston were both loved by their men. History judges them both too harshly. Venezuela says Feliz Navidad, and our Confederate friend in Brazil also says Feliz Navidad. No, Lawrence Kuffer.
Oh, he's in Brazil.
That's what he says.
Oh, didn't realize that.
Yeah. That's what he says. Or is he from San Francisco? I can't tell. Mentions Brazil. But yeah, you got a lot of comments.
Good.
I had to apologize. I'm too busy running around. Usually Tom's here to field questions from the vast audience.
How many people do we get?
I can't tell the stats. So yeah. Anyway.
I have one contemporary Civil War question for you.
Okay.
As a graduate of LSU and a professor emeritus of